The gun barrel swings right. Then it stops. Then it swings back left, hunting a shape that was there half a second ago and now isn't. That is the whole story of what happens next, compressed into one motion. A remote-operated 30mm mount, built to track a single incoming threat, trying to solve a problem it was never built to solve. 3 problems, 3 bearings, 1 turret. On the ship's internal camera feed, the kind of low-resolution grainy footage that later leaks onto Telegram channels faster than any official statement can catch up to it, you can see the traversal motor straining, the reticle jumping between targets that keep sliding out of frame, the crew's voices rising over the intercom in the clipped, overlapping way people talk when there isn't time left to be polite about who speaks first. Zoom in on that footage frame by frame, the way open-source analysts eventually did, and you can pick out the smaller tells too. A hand reaching for a headset that's already fallen off. A monitor flickering as the fire control computer tries to relock a track it just lost. A red status light blinking in the corner of frame that nobody in the room has time to look at. None of it reads as panic exactly. It reads as a system, human and mechanical both, running out of options faster than it can generate new ones. Somewhere off the Russian coast, near Novorossiysk, the patrol ship Vasily Bykov is doing what Russian state television has spent months insisting it can do without effort, fighting off Ukraine's unmanned boats. Except this time, there isn't one boat. There are 3 Magura V7 drones, spread wide across the water, closing from 3 different angles at once, their wakes barely visible against the chop, their silhouettes low enough that from the ship's bridge they read, if they read at all, as nothing more than sun glare bouncing off a wave crest. The crew has seconds. Not minutes. Seconds to decide which contact is the priority, which one to ignore, and which one is already too close to matter. Somewhere in that decision tree is a junior officer whose entire naval training never once modeled this exact scenario, because when he went through it, the scenario didn't exist yet. It's worth sitting with what that officer's training actually looked like, because the gap between it and the reality he faced is the real subject of this story. Russian naval academies still teach anti-surface warfare doctrine built around single contacts: a submarine periscope, a lone fast attack craft, a merchant vessel behaving suspiciously. The simulators run scenarios where the trainee has time to classify a threat, request authorization, and respond in a sequence that assumes minutes, not seconds. Nothing in that curriculum prepares a 20-something watch officer for 3 simultaneous contacts closing inside a detection window measured in heartbeats. He wasn't unprepared because he was careless. He was unprepared because the entire institution training him hadn't caught up to the war it was sending him into. Russian officials called this ship's class Untouchable. That word gets repeated in this story more than once, and every time it gets repeated, it gets closer to being a lie. This is not a story about one lucky hit. It's a story about a Russian ship class that was quietly redesigned, mid-war, to survive exactly this kind of attack, and about the geometry problem that redesign never solved. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a $30 million gun mount loses to 3 drones that together cost less than a used car, and why the rest of the Black Sea Fleet is already changing its behavior because of it. We spent time going through open-source ship tracking logs and commercial satellite passes for this one, and one detail kept nagging at us. The 22 160-class ships didn't just get hit, they started acting differently, weeks before anyone confirmed a loss. Fewer long patrols, shorter loiter times, a pattern that, once you see it, you can't unsee. We cross-referenced automatic identification system gaps, the stretches where a ship's transponder goes quiet, either because it was switched off deliberately or because the ship simply wasn't broadcasting from where it used to, against known Ukrainian drone boat activity windows, and the 2 datasets started lining up in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like a fleet quietly recalculating its own risk tolerance in real time, ship by ship, patrol by patrol. That cross-referencing wasn't quick work, and it's worth being honest about how unglamorous it actually was. It meant pulling weeks of AIS records into a spreadsheet, flagging every gap longer than 6 hours, then manually checking each one against known drone boat launch windows reported through Ukrainian channels, most of which never come with an exact timestamp attached. Half the gaps turned out to be nothing: a transponder outage during routine maintenance, a scheduled radio silence drill, the kind of noise that shows up in any large dataset. But a cluster of them, concentrated in the 2 weeks before this specific strike, lined up close enough with reported drone activity near Novorossiysk that treating it as coincidence started to feel like the less honest read of the data. Let's start with what Russia actually built, because the ship at the center of this story was never designed for the war it's now fighting. Project 2260 was Moscow's answer to a problem that had nothing to do with Ukraine. Back when these ships were designed, the mission was anti-piracy patrol in the eastern Mediterranean and the approaches to the Bosphorus. Calm water, slow-moving threats, maybe a skiff full of armed men off the Horn of Africa. Nothing more sophisticated than that. Some of these hulls spent early deployments escorting merchant traffic near Syria, sitting off Tartus for weeks at a time, doing nothing more dramatic than presence patrols. The kind of deployment where the biggest tactical decision of the day is which direction to point the ship for the best angle on a photo op. The design reflects that mission everywhere you look. A tall, boxy hull with high freeboard, built for comfort in a seaway, rather than for hiding a radar signature. A helicopter deck. A modular mission bay in the stern that Russian planners once bragged could hold a containerized caliber cruise missile launcher. Though in practice, most of the class never got one installed. The module sat as an empty steel box for years, a promise of future capability that quietly never arrived. Long range, long endurance. A crew that could stay at sea for weeks without resupply, living in conditions notably more comfortable than the cramped Soviet-era corvettes it was meant to eventually replace. What it was not built for was fighting off small, fast, unmanned boats skimming the surface at wave height, arriving in coordinated groups, carrying enough explosive to open a hull. Vasily Bykov is the lead ship of that class. First of its kind, first into service, and for that reason, the ship Moscow has leaned on hardest whenever it wants to prove the class has adapted. When Russian outlets wanted a symbol of naval resilience, they didn't reach for a frigate or a corvette. They reached for this one. It had already survived, or at least avoided, several earlier close calls in this war, and every time it returned safely to port, that survival got folded into the same script. Proof the ship, and by extension the whole class, had figured out the drone boat problem for good. Here's the obstacle nobody talks about in the coverage of Ukraine's sea drone campaign. Building an uncrewed boat that can survive a 2-day transit across open water, hold a stable video and control link the whole way, and still carry enough of a warhead to matter, is genuinely hard. Early models struggled with exactly that. Signal dropouts, sea state limits, boats that made it most of the way to a target and then went dark, drifting for hours afterward until someone, somewhere, either recovered them or simply wrote them off as lost at sea, another line item in a program that was still teaching itself to walk. Ukrainian drone boat teams solved it the unglamorous way. Iteration, failure, more iteration. Building on the earlier Magura V7, which had already proven the concept could sink and damage Russian hulls, before scaling up to the longer-ranged, harder-hitting V7 variant this story turns on. Somewhere in that iteration is a small team, likely working out of a facility whose exact location nobody in Ukrainian defense circles will confirm on the record, running failure after failure through the same debugging loop any engineering team recognizes. Boat goes out, boat doesn't come back. Someone pulls the last transmitted telemetry. Someone else argues about whether it was the antenna mount or the software, and 3 weeks later, a slightly different hull goes back out to try again. It's worth pausing on what that control process actually looks like on the operating end, because it explains a lot about why the Vasily Bykov engagement went the way it did. A Magura boat isn't flown the way a quadcopter drone is flown. An operator sitting at a control station, often kilometers from the coast, and well outside the boat's own effective weapons range, watches a live video feed relayed back over a satellite or line of sight link, and steers the hull using inputs that feel closer to a video game controller than to anything on a traditional ship's bridge. The lag between input and response is small but real. The operator has to read wave action off a flat video feed and anticipate how the hull will handle it half a second before it happens. The same way a person driving a remote control car learns to lead their turns rather than react to them. Now multiply that by 3, running simultaneously, each boat converging on a coordinate that puts all 3 within the same detection window of the target. And you start to understand why coordinating a saturation attack like this one is closer to conducting an orchestra than pulling a trigger. One operator's late correction, one dropped frame at the wrong moment, and the whole timing collapses before the boats ever reach the ship. Picture that control room for a second, because it looks nothing like what the mission implies. Not a darkened bunker with wall-sized screens. More often, it's a handful of monitors on folding tables, a generator humming somewhere nearby in case the grid drops, 3 operators sitting close enough to talk to each other without a headset, running a countdown between themselves in low voices while a supervisor watches all 3 feeds at once, from a position where they can see everyone's screen but control none of them directly. Somebody keeps a paper log of timestamps, because software logs can be lost to a dropped connection, and paper can't. It's a strange mix of cutting-edge and improvised, a mission that ends in a multi-million-dollar warship losing power, run out of a room that looks more like a small-town emergency dispatch center than anything resembling a military command post. We dug through the pattern of Black Sea Fleet losses that came before this one, and there's a footnote in that pattern that tells the real story. It isn't the big-name losses everyone already knows, the flagship cruiser Moskva, the landing ship Caesar Kunikov, the missile corvette Ivanovets, the patrol ship Sergei Kotov. It's what Russia did after each of those losses. Every single time, the fleet adjusted. Every single time, the adjustment wasn't enough. After the early Black Sea Fleet losses, Moscow's answer for its surface ships wasn't to build something new from the keel up. There wasn't time for that, and there wasn't money for it either. The answer was to bolt defenses onto what already existed. Remote-operated 30mm gun mounts started appearing on ships that never had them. Short-range air defense turrets got welded onto decks that were never stressed to carry them. State television called it modernization. Naval analysts called it something closer to triage, a phrase that gets used a lot in this story, because it's the only word that fits a fleet trying to patch a hull-shaped hole in its doctrine, with whatever weapon happened to be sitting in a warehouse near the shipyard that month. Vasily Bykov got the same treatment. A 30mm remote weapon station, aimed and fired from inside the ship rather than by a gunner exposed on deck. A new fire control link, tying that gun to whatever radar and optical sensors the ship carried. On paper, a serious upgrade. In a press release, proof the fleet had learned its lesson. The footage Russian media ran at the time showed a crewman inside a control room, headset on, joystick in hand, tracking a simulated target on a monitor, while a narrator explained, in the confident tone reserved for finished products rather than field experiments, that the ship could now defend itself against exactly the kind of threat that would eventually sink it. Here's what's most surprising about that upgrade, though. Nobody at the shipyard appears to have run the numbers on what happens when the threat isn't 1 drone but 3. A single remote 30mm mount can only point in one direction. It can only be slewing toward one contact at a time. Against a lone attacking boat, that's fine. The gun swings, the gun tracks, the gun fires. Against 3 boats approaching from 3 different bearings, the gun has to choose, and every second spent choosing is a second none of the 3 boats are being shot at. That single fact, 1 gun, 1 bearing, 1 decision at a time, is the entire tactical logic behind what Ukraine's Magura V7 groups do. It isn't a mystery weapon, it isn't some breakthrough in warhead design, it's arithmetic. 3 attackers divided by 1 working gun equals a window where at least 2 of them are unopposed. So the ship had a gun. The gun had a blind arc. And for months, Vasily Bykov didn't have to find that out the hard way. That changed the Day 3 Magura V7 boats left the water at once. Russian claims about the 22-160 class being untouchable didn't come from nowhere. For a while, they were almost believable. The retrofit gun mounts genuinely did force Ukrainian drone teams to change tactics. No more single-boat runs at a target that could now shoot back. State broadcasters ran segments showing the new turrets, the new radar dishes, footage of crews training to fend off small boat swarms. The message was simple. The fleet has adapted, the drones have been solved. Move on. We think that message says something about how this war gets narrated on Russian television more broadly. Every setback becomes a temporary problem, solved by the next press conference. Every fix gets announced before it's actually tested. The 2260's air defense retrofit is a case study in that pattern. A real engineering response to a real threat, oversold the moment it left the shipyard. Here's an unpopular take, and we'll say it plainly. Calling a single gun mount an adequate defense against a saturation attack was never an engineering judgment. It was a public relations decision dressed up as one. Whoever signed off on describing the class as untouchable knew, or should have known, that one gun cannot cover 3 bearings. That's not hindsight. That's basic geometry, available to anyone who looked at the retrofit before it went on television. Now here's the complication that changes what this story is actually about. It isn't really about one gun mount failing. It's about what the Black Sea Fleet does for a living, and how badly that job has already been damaged. The 2260 class exists to patrol. That's the entire point of the ship. Long endurance, comfortable seakeeping, a crew that can stay out for weeks watching a stretch of water. Ships like Vasily Bykov were meant to be the eyes of the fleet, sitting off the Ukrainian coast, watching for grain corridor traffic, watching for drone boat launches, reporting back before anything got close to the fleet's more valuable hulls. A patrol ship that's afraid to patrol has failed at its only job, no matter how many press releases say otherwise. Ship tracking data and commercial satellite passes from recent weeks show exactly that failure taking shape before this particular engagement ever happened. The 22160 class hulls stopped running their old patrol patterns. Loiter times that used to stretch for days got cut down to hours. Routes that used to range well out into open water started hugging the coastline near Novorossiysk instead, staying inside the protective umbrella of shore-based air defense and closer to safe anchorage. That is not the behavior of a fleet that believes its own headlines. That is the behavior of a crew, and a command structure above that crew that has quietly concluded the open water no longer belongs to them. Before we get to the engagement itself, it's worth spending a moment on how a story like this actually gets confirmed, because the process says almost as much as the result. Commercial satellite operators pass over the Black Sea on a predictable schedule, and open-source analysts, some professional, working for subscription intelligence services, some hobbyists running the analysis for free out of genuine interest, have learned to treat those passes the way a detective treats a crime scene. The first image after a reported strike rarely shows anything conclusive. What it shows is a shadow, a wake pattern that doesn't match the ship's usual berth. Maybe a faint discoloration in the water that could be fuel. Could be nothing. Analysts flag it, argue about it in threads, wait for the next pass. It's the accumulation of 2, 3, 4 passes over consecutive days. The hulls draft visibly deeper in the water, a tug present where no tug was present before, the absence of the usual maintenance activity around the pier, that turns a maybe into something closer to a confirmed loss. None of it comes with an official Russian statement attached. It comes from people squinting at 50-centimeter resolution imagery and comparing timestamps, and in this war, that quiet, patient, unofficial process has turned out to be more reliable than anything either government has put out through a press office. We keep coming back to that detail because it's the part of this story that never makes it onto Russian television. You can announce a new gun mount. You can put a reporter on deck to film it. What you can't fake is a patrol log. And the patrol logs, read against satellite timestamps over these past weeks, tell a story the press releases don't. Put yourself in the position of a Ukrainian planner tracking that shift. You don't need spies inside Novorossiysk. You don't need signals intelligence pulled from a compromised network. You need a public ship tracking feed and a few weeks of patience, watching a warship's confidence visibly drain out of its own movements. That's the strange asymmetry of this war at sea. Some of the most useful intelligence comes from data nobody is even trying to hide. Most people assume a warship's survival comes down to steel, armor plate, hull compartmentalization, how much punishment the structure can absorb before it goes down. That assumption is mostly wrong for this kind of fight. The 2260 class isn't losing because its hull is thin. It's losing because of what it can and can't see, and how fast it can react to what it sees. A surface radar mounted at a normal shipboard height has a hard physical limit on how far it can detect something skimming right at the waterline. That limit is the radar horizon, and it has nothing to do with how expensive or modern the radar is. It's pure geometry, the curvature of the Earth itself getting in the way. The same reason a lighthouse keeper can see a ship's mast on the horizon long before they can see its hull. A drone boat riding low on the water, throwing almost no wake, simply doesn't appear on that radar until it's already inside a few kilometers, sometimes less. Push the radar antenna higher on the mast and you buy back some of that range, which is exactly why so many navies are now scrambling to add elevated sensor masts and tethered aerostats to ships that were never designed to carry them. Another retrofit, chasing another version of the same problem. on ships across multiple fleets far beyond just this one. That's the second half of the arithmetic problem, sitting right behind the gun's blind arc. First, the radar sees the threat late, because physics won't let it see any earlier. Second, once it is seen, the gun can only engage one contact while the crew scrambles to acquire the other two by eye, by a secondary optical sensor, or not at all. 3 boats, arriving from 3 different bearings, timed to cross that short detection range within moments of each other, turn those 2 limitations into a single failure. Not a design flaw exactly, more a mismatch between what the ship was built to fight and what it's actually being asked to fight. What this tells us about the war at sea right now is bigger than one ship. For decades, naval doctrine assumed the expensive platform wins by default. More steel, more sensors, more crew training beats whatever the cheaper side can throw at it. The Black Sea has quietly inverted that assumption. A fleet with fewer resources, no functioning navy of comparable size, and none of Russia's shipbuilding capacity, has spent the better part of this war forcing warships to hide from boats that cost less than the fuel it takes to keep those warships steaming. That's not a footnote. That's the headline of this entire war at sea, and Vasily Bykov is just the latest name added to it. So the ship had a blind spot in its radar coverage. It had a gun that could only face one direction, and for a while none of that mattered, because no one had sent 3 boats at once, timed close enough together to matter. That was about to stop being true. Here's where the cost side of this story becomes impossible to ignore. Ukrainian officials have put the price of a single Magura series drone boat in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not free, not disposable in the sense of being worthless, but cheap enough that losing one, or even 2, in a failed attack barely registers against the budget of a naval drone program. To put that number in perspective, it's roughly the cost of a single modern Western-made air defense interceptor missile, the kind of missile a defending ship would need several of, fired in succession, just to deal with one incoming threat, let alone 3 arriving at once. The economics were lopsided before either side fired a shot. Compare that to what independent reporting has estimated for a Project 22-160 hull, figures that run into the tens of millions of dollars per ship, before you even count the cost of the retrofit gun mounts and sensor upgrades bolted on afterward, or the years of shipyard time it takes to build a replacement in a country whose shipbuilding industry has been strained by sanctions, lost imported components, and the diversion of skilled labor to other parts of the war effort. That's the exchange rate underneath this entire story, and it's the number Russian television never puts on screen. A few $100,000 per attacking boat against tens of millions of dollars sitting at anchor, trying not to look like a target. Militaries have a term for that kind of mismatch, an unfavorable exchange rate. It means every engagement, win or lose, degrades the more expensive side faster than it degrades the cheaper one. Even a failed attack, one where every drone gets shot down, still costs the defender more in fuel, ammunition, wear on the gun mount, and crew fatigue than it costs the attacker in replacement hulls. Run that exchange enough times, and the expensive side loses, even when it wins. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you were commanding one of the remaining 2 260-class ships right now, knowing what happened to Vasily Bykov, would you take that ship out on an open-water patrol tomorrow? Or would you find a reason to stay close to Novorossiysk and let someone else's hull take the risk? Yeah, there isn't an obviously right answer, and that's exactly the problem Russian fleet commanders are facing this week. Now to the engagement itself. Reconstructed from open-source ship tracking data, satellite imagery of the aftermath, and statements from Ukrainian defense officials describing how the operation was built. The plan starts with separation. 3 Magura V7 boats don't approach in a line, and they don't approach together from one direction. They're routed to arrive from 3 different bearings, timed so their final approach legs overlap within the same short window, the same window defined by that radar horizon limitation. The intent isn't subtlety, it's saturation. Give the ship's one working gun 3 problems to solve in the handful of seconds it has to solve any of them. Before that final approach even begins, though, there's a slower, quieter phase that gets skipped over in most tellings of this story. Hours earlier, likely well before dawn, the 3 boats leave separate launch points along the Ukrainian-controlled coastline, chosen specifically so that their transit routes don't overlap and don't give away, through any single sighting, that a coordinated operation is underway. Each boat runs largely on a pre-programmed route for the bulk of its transit, conserving operator attention and control link bandwidth for the part of the mission that actually requires a human hand. The final approach, the target acquisition, the moment where a boat has to react to what the target ship is actually doing, rather than what a planner assumed it would be doing the night before. For hours, the most dangerous part of the mission is also the most boring part. 3 small hulls crossing open water, alone, exposed to any patrol aircraft or picket ship that happens to cross their path, with nothing to do but hold course and hope nothing finds them first. Vasily Bykov's crew gets a detection, probably visual or from a secondary sensor, rather than the main search radar, given how close a low-riding drone boat can close before it's seen at all. The gun mount slews toward the nearest contact. It's doing exactly what it was built to do, tracking one target, preparing to engage. Then the second contact appears, from a different bearing, close enough that the crew has to make a choice. Engage the first, ignore the second, and hope. Or split attention and engage neither fast enough. Then the third. This is the moment the ship's untouchable reputation stops being a claim and becomes a test. Not a test of armor, a test of whether one gun mount and one crew, reacting inside a window measured in seconds, can solve a problem that has 3 separate answers. It wasn't guaranteed to work, and it's worth being honest about that. Sea state matters to a drone boat riding low on the water far more than it matters to a 1,300-ton patrol ship. Rough water can knock a small unmanned hull off its planned track, degrade its control link, or simply swamp it before it ever reaches the target. Ukrainian planners running these missions have to pick a weather window carefully, because the same wave height that helps a drone boat hide from radar can also be the thing that sinks it before the fight even starts. There's also the control link itself. Every Magura boat is guided over a data connection that has to survive jamming, has to survive distance, has to survive the boat's own low profile blocking its own antenna at the wrong angle. Losing that link mid-approach doesn't just fail one boat, it can break the timing the whole 3-boat approach depends on. Russian electronic warfare units stationed around Novorossiysk have spent months trying to build a jamming picture dense enough to blind exactly this kind of link. And by most open-source accounts, they've had partial success. Enough to occasionally force a boat off its planned route. Rarely enough to stop an entire coordinated mission outright. None of that stopped this particular attack from reaching its target. Whatever margin existed for weather and signal loss, it held long enough for all 3 boats to arrive close to together, which tells you something about how deliberately this specific mission was planned rather than improvised. 3 boats reached attack range. The gun engaged 1. 2 others did not need it to miss twice. They only needed it distracted once. What came next is the part of this story Russian officials have been the quietest about. Reporting from Ukrainian defense sources and open-source naval trackers describes hits below the waterline, consistent with the warhead payload the V7 variant is built to carry. Heavier than its V5 predecessor, designed specifically to punch through a hull rather than just scorch a superstructure. A patrol ship, built with high freeboard and a roomy hull for comfortable long patrols, is not the same as a ship built with the kind of compartmentalization that keeps flooding contained after a hit like that. In the immediate aftermath, open-source flight tracking channels picked up what looked like an uptick in helicopter activity out of bases near Novorossiysk. The kind of pattern that, in prior incidents involving this fleet, has correlated with search and rescue tasking rather than routine patrol flights. Russia has never published a casualty figure for this engagement, and given the pattern established after previous Black Sea fleet losses, it likely never will in any verifiable form. What tends to surface instead, weeks or months later, are scattered regional obituary notices, a name here, a hometown there, on local Russian social media pages, far from any official channel, the kind of quiet grief that never gets connected publicly to the ship or the date. But that pattern matches closely enough for open-source researchers who track this sort of thing to draw their own conclusions. It's a grim kind of evidence processing, piecing together a casualty count not from any single confirmed source, but from the accumulated weight of small, disconnected fragments that all happen to point the same direction. One of those fragments, surfaced by researchers combing regional pages in the weeks after the strike, was a short post from a small town several hundred kilometers from Novorossiysk. A mother thanking neighbors for their condolences, no cause of death listed, no unit named, just a date that happened to fall 2 days after the engagement, and a photo of a young man in a naval uniform, nobody outside that town would ever have reason to notice. It's the kind of post that means nothing on its own and everything in aggregate. One data point among dozens that researchers quietly file away, cross-reference, and never publish as a headline because no single one of them proves anything by itself. That's the texture of loss in this war on the Russian side. Not a casualty list, not a memorial service covered by state media, just a slow accumulation of small towns learning, one obituary at a time, what their government won't say out loud. Satellite imagery in the days that followed shows a hull sitting differently in the water near its usual anchorage pattern. Imagery experts who track the Black Sea Fleet have flagged the change as consistent with significant damage, though the full extent, and whether the ship is a total loss or a long-term repair case, is something only Russian Naval Command currently knows for certain, and they are not saying. That silence is itself a data point. When a fleet loses a ship it's proud of, it usually says nothing at all, and lets the imagery speak for the story it doesn't want to tell. Here's the take that'll probably draw some pushback. The Untouchable branding wasn't just wrong, it was reckless in a way that likely got sailors hurt or killed for no operational gain. Calling a retrofit gun mount adequate against a saturation attack wasn't a defensive improvement being honestly described, it was a morale narrative, built for domestic television, that put a crew in a position to believe their ship could do something it demonstrably could not. Somebody signed off on that messaging knowing the geometry didn't support it. That's on the officials who approved the narrative, not on the sailors who had seconds to react to a problem their own command told them was already solved. So here's the layered question, sitting underneath everything so far. Everyone assumed the answer to Ukraine's sea drones was a bigger gun, a better radar, a faster reaction. Vasily Bykov had all three, relatively speaking, compared to earlier Black Sea Fleet losses. It still lost, which means the real question was never, can this ship shoot down a drone? It was, can this ship's entire sensor and weapons architecture solve more than one problem at once? And the answer, it turns out, is no. Not because of some hidden flaw, but because nobody built that ship, or its retrofit, to solve that particular problem in the first place. That question doesn't stay contained to one hull. It applies to every surface ship the Black Sea Fleet still has left in a similar class, which is exactly why the fleet's broader behavior has started to shift. Engagement pattern analysis from the weeks around this strike shows the rest of the 22 160 class ships pulling their operating pattern in even tighter than before. Where a handful of these hulls used to split time between coastal patrol and longer-ranged loitering further from shore, recent tracking shows almost all of that longer-ranged activity gone. What's left looks closer to a fleet keeping its remaining patrol ships inside a defensive perimeter it can actually protect with shore-based systems, rather than trusting the ship's own defenses out in open water. That's a quiet admission, and it's a bigger one than losing a single hull. It means the Black Sea Fleet's capacity to actually watch the sea, its whole reason for having this ship class in the first place, has shrunk. Not because Ukraine sank the entire fleet, because Ukraine made the fleet afraid to use the ships it still has the way they were designed to be used. We think that's the real cost of this attack, more than the hull itself. A patrol ship sitting safely at anchor near Novorossiysk isn't patrolling, it's hiding. And a navy that's hiding its patrol ships has already lost the argument it spent months making on state television. There's one detail from the tracking data that stuck with us more than any other. In the weeks before this specific strike, one of the sister 2260 hulls was observed running a patrol leg roughly half the length of its typical pattern from earlier in the war, then reversing course well short of where it would normally have turned. Nothing forced that reversal that day. No known drone activity was reported nearby at the time. It reversed anyway. That's not caution born of a specific threat. That's caution born of knowing, in a general and constant way, that the threat could be anywhere, and that the ship no longer has confidence it would see it coming in time. Now for the part of the story that never makes it into a Russian Ministry of Defense statement. What 3 drone boats worth a combined sum in the hundreds of thousands of dollars actually did to a fleet's operational posture. A Black Sea Fleet with fewer functioning patrol ships, or with the ones it has too cautious to patrol properly, has a smaller window of warning before anything approaches its more valuable assets. Its remaining major surface combatants, its logistics ships, the port infrastructure at Novorossiysk itself, which has already absorbed strikes of its own during this war. Every patrol ship pulled back toward safe anchorage is a gap in that warning coverage. Gaps compound. A fleet that keeps compounding gaps eventually finds itself defending a smaller and smaller piece of water, whether or not anyone in Moscow ever calls that a retreat. There's a second-order effect here too, one that rarely gets discussed alongside the purely military consequences. Novorossiysk isn't just a naval base. It's one of Russia's most important commercial export terminals, moving a significant share of the country's oil exports out through the Black Sea. Every time a warship near that port gets hit, maritime insurers quietly recalculate the risk premium on tankers loading anywhere nearby, and shipping companies quietly recalculate whether the extra insurance cost is worth the trip at all. A single drone boat engagement against a patrol ship doesn't just cost Russia a hull. Over time, repeated often enough, it costs Russia's export economy in ways that show up on a balance sheet in Moscow, long after the story has stopped trending anywhere else. We cut a section from this video about the specific electronic warfare countermeasures Russia has tried bolting onto these ships to jam drone control links. There's more to that story than we had room for here. Comment EW if you want a full breakdown of that fight in a follow-up. The aftermath of this strike answers most of the open questions this story started with, but not all of them cleanly. Does this mean the Black Sea Fleet abandons Novorossiysk area patrols entirely? Almost certainly not. The fleet still needs some forward presence, if only to watch for exactly this kind of attack before it happens. What changes is the shape of that presence. Shorter legs, tighter coordination with shore-based air defense, probably more reliance on aircraft and land-based radar to extend the warning range that shipboard sensors can no longer be trusted to provide on their own. Does it mean the retrofit gun mounts were a wasted investment? Not entirely either. Against a single boat, or even two boats approaching along similar bearings, that gun likely still works as intended. What this engagement exposed wasn't that the upgrade failed at its job. It's that the job itself was defined too narrowly, built to answer yesterday's attack rather than tomorrow's. And that's the uncomfortable pattern running through this entire war at sea. Russia keeps solving the last attack. Ukraine keeps building the next one. By the time a defensive fix reaches the fleet, the offense has already moved one step past it. That gap is not something a single gun mount, however well designed, can close by itself. None of this came easily for Ukraine's drone boat program either, and it's worth saying plainly. Coordinating 3 unmanned boats to arrive within the same tight window, across open water, without a functioning navy of comparable size to protect the launch and recovery points, is a logistics problem as much as a technical one. Launch sites have had to move repeatedly to avoid Russian strikes on the coastline. Control infrastructure has had to be hardened against exactly the kind of jamming Russia has tried deploying in response. Every one of those problems got solved incrementally, by teams working with a fraction of the budget their opponent has, which is its own kind of statement about where the advantage in this specific fight actually sits. It's also worth remembering that this program has taken losses of its own, and doesn't get to skip that part of the story just because it's the side currently winning the news cycle. Individual Magura boats have been destroyed mid-transit by Russian helicopter gunships hunting them with door-mounted machine guns, picked off by patrol aircraft, or simply lost to mechanical failure, far from any battle at all. The program's entire operating philosophy is built around accepting that attrition as a cost of doing business rather than as a reason to stop. A mindset that a traditional navy, built around the idea that every hull is precious and every loss is a crisis, has historically struggled to adopt. That difference in philosophy, as much as any difference in hardware, might be the real edge here. Here's what strikes us most: stepping back from the tactics and the hardware. This entire engagement was decided by a detail that has nothing to do with explosives, warheads, or armor plate. It was decided by the field of view of a single gun mount. Somewhere in a design review, years before this war reached the Black Sea in its current form, an engineer specified how many contacts that mount needed to track at once, and specified a number that assumed the old threat: a lone skiff, a single fast boat, the piracy scenario the whole class was originally built around. Nobody updated that assumption fast enough, and Vasily Bykov paid for that gap in a design review, with a hole below the waterline. Would you have caught that gap if you'd been the one running the design review 5 years before any of this? Most naval planners around the world didn't, not for their own fleets either. Cheap, coordinated, unmanned surface attacks are still a new enough problem that almost no navy has fully solved the one gun against 3 bearings arithmetic. Russia just happens to be the navy currently paying tuition for that lesson in real time in open water, on camera. That's the part of this story that should worry more than one country's naval planners. The tactic that beat Vasily Bykov doesn't require a fleet. It doesn't require an air force. It requires 3 boats, a coordinated launch plan, and a target whose defenses were built to answer a different, older question. Any coastal navy operating expensive surface ships near a capable drone boat opponent is looking at some version of the same math. Naval planning circles in several countries with contested coastlines have reportedly already started commissioning internal studies on exactly this scenario, quietly, without wanting to say so publicly, because saying so publicly is itself an admission that the multi-million-dollar ships currently in service were designed for a threat model that no longer fully applies. So where does that leave the untouchable claim Russian officials spent months repeating on state television? It leaves it exactly where most wartime claims about invulnerable hardware eventually end up, quietly retired, never formally retracted, just replaced by a new claim about a new upgrade the next time cameras are rolling. Watch for that next announcement. It's coming, because the pattern hasn't broken once in this entire war, only repeated itself with a different ship's name attached each time. What hasn't changed is the arithmetic underneath all of it. A few $100,000 per drone boat against tens of millions of dollars per hull, against a fleet that can build patrol ships far faster than it can build new tactics to protect them. That ratio is the real story here, more than any single ship's name. As long as it holds, expect more mornings like this one for the Black Sea Fleet. And if you want to understand exactly how Ukraine built the boat that makes this math work in the first place, that's a story we're already putting together next. If this breakdown changed how you think about what untouchable actually means in this war, tell us in the comments, and subscribe, because this exchange rate isn't finished playing out, and neither are we.